Very good morning to all of you, and welcome to this last discussion of Abu Talib's travels. What I want to do today is fundamentally to talk about fundamentally to sort of wind up and talk once again about technology, and especially today about Abu Talib's, articulation of the status of women in both the East and the West, because Abu Talib himself wrote a separate treatise while he was in England on the relative merits and demerits of the independence of women in the Asiatic and in the West. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit. But before that, let me sort of just give you a few oversights, as it were. Now, 1764, after the Battle of Buxar, I remind you that the East India Company was given the Diwani, or the overlordship of Bengal, and therefore there was an acute sort of crisis in terms of trained officials who could take over the tax collection. And this is when, with Warren Hastings in 1772, that the revenue offices were all shifted from Murshidabad to Kolkata. So you can see why Abu Talib was traveling to Kolkata in search of a better, as it were, profession. And Abu Talib, interestingly, as I point out repeatedly, was pauperized in Kolkata. He was almost broke, so he did not get a position. But this, tradition of the collector for the East India Company, which has percolated down to the administrator, as it were, in our modern systems also. Now we don't call him a collector, but a commissioner, really. But this is the profession for which Abu Talib arrived in Kolkata, became a pauper, and then traveled to England. Now, I have already made a significant amount of comments on how Abu Talib sort of cites English superiority in technology and sort of foregrounds many of the English advances made. But I would also like to just remind you that, for the Mughals and for the Muslims of India, 1757 was largely catastrophic, in the sense that, power passing on to the British meant that a lot of Muslims had actually turned away from education in science. And the man who brought science back to Muslim culture and strongly pleaded for, a revision of looking at the West was Sir Syed Ahmad Khan. But Syed Ahmad Khan was writing in the middle of the century, and he certainly must have had access to Abu Talib's strong plea in this context. So when we talk about the lingering afterlife of Abu Talib, we must remember that, Abu Talib was one of the first Muslim travelers, one of the many, or rather a few Muslim travelers, who was trying to bring back this culture of science into Indian Muslims. Now, Ahmed Khan, Syed Ahmed, of course, rebelled against established orthodoxy and asked that if the Mussulmans be true warrior and thinks his religion right, then let him come fearlessly to the battleground and do unto Western knowledge and modern research what his forefathers did to Greek philosophy. And you remember Abu Talib talking in its travelogues that the Muslims should look at his travels as a source of access to modern science and change themselves, which he fears the indolent Muslims will not do. So there is a direct line, as it were, from Abu Talib to Sir Syed Ahmad Khan in terms of technology. Now, one of the things that I did not really do is that, I did not mention exactly which were the sciences or scientific spots that he visits. What are these, and what are his comments about these science innovations. So I'll just, before I move on to this question of women, I just briefly like to linger over the particular instances in which Abu Taleb talks about science. So he talks, for example, about the mills for grinding corn. So you see, one of the things that Abu Taleb is looking at is not really how science is used for esoteric purposes. He does not go to the academies of science. He does not go to the research institutes, as it were. Rather, he talks about these particular places where science is put to everyday use. For Abu Taleb, the wonders of Vilayat was not in just exotic locations or fantastic spaces. It was largely, and that is what Abu Taleb's contribution is, if you ask me, in looking at the ways in which science was being harnessed for everyday use, and therefore transforming the lives of ordinary people. So along with his articulations about the military, it's also important to understand that Abu Taleb's comment about ordinary life being transformed by science was a major intervention, as it were, within the travel writing of the period. So he was claiming science not just for scientists but for the common Indian Muslims. So this is the windmills that he talks about, mills for grinding corn. And he talks about two kinds of mills. And remember, there had not been rampant industrialization. So these mills were largely powered by water and wind. But then Abu Taleb quickly identifies the need for such technology in the subcontinent. He says, I, however, think that our hand mills might prove very useful with an army where it will often happen that the hungry troops make a Caesar of wheat or barley without having the means to grinding it. So he's fundamentally saying that even in Muslim conquests, hand mills should be an essential part of the army. He talks about then the iron foundries and the manufacture of needles. You see, the very trivial needle becomes a very crucial passage in Abu Taleb. And he says that the manufacture of needles astonished me. A bundle of steel wires was thrown into a wheel, which at one turn threw them out on the opposite side, cut into a number of pieces of proper length, both of which effected by machinery in the shortest time imaginable. So you can see this kind of astonishment and wonder which Abu Taleb sees, and this attempt to see the mass production that he is talking about. The manufacture of needles astonished me. It was my astonishment. If my astonishment was excited at the needle factory, it was much more so when I saw a spinning engine. By the turn of one large wheel, 100 others were put in motion, which spun at the same time some 1,000 threads of sufficient finesse to make some good muslin. Now, this, I think, is an important passage because, you see, the English at this point of time was competing with Indian cloth export, especially the export of Indian yarn. And the East India Company had already put a kind of a 20% excise on the export of Indian yarn at this point of time. So it was very vital for the English to quickly find machines that could produce mass yarn and clothing, so that it could gradually stifle out the Indian export component in clothing. And therefore, Abu Taleb's visit to this, spinning machine or the spinning factory is, significant because Abu Taleb is getting wonderfully excited at the spinning of the yarn. But simultaneously, these are the spaces where India was gradually being throttled out in terms of its exports. Then he goes, of course, to the hydraulic machine for supplying London with water. And you will remember that, many of the northern cities where Abu Taleb had was staying. Lucknow, for example, was facing acute water scarcities, and therefore is a stupendous work. There is a machine called a pump. So he's looking at the first pumps in England, whence by the slightest exertion of the arm, the water is easily forced. It is a very simple contrivance and much preferable to our wells. So Abu Talib, you see, one of the features of the travelogue is that one of Abu Talib's feet is always located within India. And therefore is looking back and trying to see which one of these technologies can be seen as modern when compared with the pre-modern technologies of India. So this kind of a consciousness about early modernity and the role of technology within it and the need for India to embrace such modernity is something that Abu Talib is very consciously trying to import. Then, of course, Abu Talib talks or devotes an entire chapter discussing kitchen appliances, and then goes on to talk about the hot houses of London, where vegetables are kept, raise vegetables and fruits in the coldest season of the year, and the tables of the rich are covered with pineapples, melons, and other fruits of the torrid zone. In this instance, and you see how he's looking back and trying to sort of educate, autoethnographically write what the Europeans are doing. In this instance, they excel us, for none of the emperors of Hindustan, in all the plenitude of their power, could ever have forced a gooseberry or a cherry, two of the most common fruits in Europe, to grow in their dominion. So Abu Talib is fundamentally saying that by their technology, they are able also to grow food and thereby supply them with exotic, Indian or rather warm climate vegetables and fruits. So he's seeing the English as rapidly striding forward in terms of food production. So once again, food, cloth, yarn, everything that has to do with the contemporary Indian and the contemporary British is being looked at by Abu Talib. Of course, as I pointed out, a significant part of Abu Talib's travelogue talks about, the army and the machinery. So he says he's going to Woolwich, which once housed the Arsenal Football Club, and he talks about the particularly being attracted of casting the cannonballs and shells. So see, Abu Talib is very strategically, traveling. He's already told you that, the turnpikes and the taxes mean that he has to spend a lot of money to travel. So he's picking his spots: food, clothing, and now arms and armaments. So in terms of boring and shaping the exterior surface of the guns at the same time, all done by the motion of a wheel turned by a steam engine, which so facilitated the work that an old woman or a child might have turned. So more and more, you see in the travels, Abu Talib is suggesting that true and innovative machinery will make production in terms of a mass quality, and secondly, will make it easy in terms of production by anybody, as it were. So the worker does not have to be too skilled. He's suggesting that it is the machinery which will do all the heavy work. And of course, he talks about, and this is something which I also have underlined time and again, he talks about the English and the perfection in their navy, doubtless being the chief cause of their prosperity. And Mushirul Hasan, whom I've quoted again and again, and I repeat, notes how Abu Talib was one of the first Asians to uncover the roots of Britain's maritime power and establish the connection between industrial revolution and economic prosperity. So Abu Talib, in terms of technology, is talking in terms of a triangle. What is this triangle? Technology, economic prowess, military prowess. And within this space, he's suggesting that technology has transformed the lives of not only the army, the military, and the aristocracy, but also the ordinary class of people. So that is then, one of the things that you need to take a very careful look at as to how Abu Taleb makes this close association between technology, science, and economic progress and the common man. This is something which you might be sort of asked as to what are the areas which Abu Taleb sees the European vastly superior in. Now, I, of course, talked about it, but I did not really sort of put a lot of effort into this. But I need to now, when Abu Taleb talks about the English legal system. You see, it's paradoxical that while Abu Taleb talks a great length about the English technology and science, he's quite critical of the English system of law. Now, the later travelers will talk about this English legal system and the rule of law and how is it equal for everybody. But Abu Taleb, paradoxically, is quite critical. And he says that I had the misfortune to acquire a little experience in this way being legal. And he talks about purchasing some cloth and being challenged by the merchant and having had to pay a fine. And therefore, he suggests that the British legal system is extremely convoluted, that the common man cannot understand legal parlance or the legal complexities, and that he is entirely at the mercy of the lawyers and the judges when it comes to the dispensation of the law. So quite obviously, Abu Taleb seems to suggest that the Mughal system of jurisprudence is superior to the Western way. And therefore, he suggests that the British courts of law in India should be revised. He writes, I cannot pass over this opportunity of freely expressing my sentiments with respect to the establishment of British courts of law in India, which I contend are converted to the very worst of purposes. And unless an alteration takes place in the system, few months elapse that some respectable and wealthy man is not attacked by the harpies who swarm around the courts of judicature. So he's looking at, European legal systems as inimical to the Indian cause and purpose, and how the European judicial system is going to be held hostage by the presence of unscrupulous lawyers, so that common men and women will be afraid and will be severely harassed by the legal system. So he suggests that another mode of acquiring money is by frightening people with the terrors of the English law. So very, very perceptively, Abu Taleb has suggested that the legal system will be held hostage by a breed of lawyers. And this, in many ways, you see, instead of the individual system of the law of the Qazi, for example, or the village legal systems, going to the elaborate facade of the British legal system actually put a severe drainage on Indian citizens. So not only is Abu Taleb talking about the legal system in England, and this is the most important part, he's sort of witnessing how this legal system might affect Indians. So Abu Taleb is conscious and he's very aware that the British imperialism in India is here to stay, and that whatever he's talking about, technology or the judicial system, will impact Indians in a very big way in the near future. In that sense, Abu Taleb is almost predicting the consequences of colonialism in India, as it were, in subsequent times. Right. So having made these points, having sort of alerted you to these spaces and these criticisms of science, technology, and the judicial system, it is now my last segment of the discussion to talk about how Abu Taleb looks at the issue of women. We've already seen how conservative Abu Taleb is in terms of religion, right? And how he sees that, the Indian religious way of life is far superior to the depraved and very often irreligious, aesthetic, atheist way of British life, and how he sees, how he links British criminality and prostitution to this way of, immorality and the lack of religion. So now he will talk about the condition of women, and one of the major criticisms that the British had of India was that it was extremely primitive and conservative when it came to women. Of course, there was a lot of criticism about the sati system in the Hindu way, and of course the parda and the zanana and the harem in the Muslim configurations. Many of these European travelers were castigating Indians as barbaric and primitive because of the way in which women were victimized. And very carefully, Europe was seen as a kind of a liberal society because of and progressive and modern society in the way in which women were treated and given greater liberty in Europe. So a clear stereotype was emerging in India and the West about Oriental's sort of despotism when it came to women. And Abu Talib, interestingly, while he was in England, wrote a Persian tract of approximately 3,000 words and titled it in Persian, of course, and got it translated by his friends, and titled it A Vindication of the Liberties of Asiatic Women. I repeat, A Vindication of the Liberties of Asiatic Women. This was published in 1802, 3, and circulated in England as a kind of a response to the English characterization of male tyranny in the Indian treatment of women. So he's now trying to vindicate and suggest how Asiatic women are actually more liberated than Western women, right? So the English suggested that the women of Asia have no liberty at all, but live like slaves without honor and liberty, and honor and authority, sorry. And Abu Talib responds in the preface by arguing that the same wrong opinion is deeply rooted in the minds of other Europeans. So he's writing this to counter this discourse. So this too is a very interesting act of autoethnography, right? In the contact zone, when the Europeans and the Indians come into contact with each other, the Europeans see the Orient as primitive, as marked by sensuality, as marked by tyranny, and as marked by an enormous oppression of women. In this case, Abu Talib refuses to be transcultured, he refuses to be transformed, and he instead tries to write in his own autoethnographic status about how actually Indian women are more liberated than the British. Now, this is very interesting because Abu Talib also tries to create a reverse ethnography about European women. He sees European women as extremely, forward and promiscuous. So Abu Talib does not associate European female liberty with any kind of moral virtue. He does not see this as a sign of modernity. He rather sees this as an opportunity of depravity. And he immediately talks about how, prostitution is rampant within England as a result of this, how many of the high society women engage in illicit affairs, and how therefore European society is progressively moving towards chaos because of the way in which he treats his the women. Abu Talib, is sort of effusive about the beauty of external beauty of European women, but he suggests that within this external beauty lies the canker and the problems of immorality and profanity. Instead, what he does is that he talks about several Indian women who have gone to uh, England and have settled in England. For example, there's this woman called Noor Begum, and he makes a contrast between the European women who are given to the enjoyment of their selves rather than their children and husbands, and he compares them with the Indian women who reside in England but are totally dedicated to their family and to their people. Right. So for example, he talks about the 60,000 prostitutes. He refers them as fahisha, who sort of exist only in Marylebone in London, and he sees this women walking the streets of London as evidences that female independence does not necessarily lead to any kind of moral upliftment. And he, of course, as I said, praises Noor Begum, for example, for being, completely dedicated to the family. So clearly, there is a demarcation made by Abu Taleb about the Western women whom he sees as fallen and promiscuous versus the Indian women who are, more liberated by their remaining indoors and who are much more morally and socially committed to their families. Now, of course, let me sort of make this point that these are all Abu Talib's defenses, and I'm not trying to justify them in any sense of the term. But how does he, say that, or where does he say that Indian women are being criticized, and how are they more liberal? So he identifies some of the specific, European concerns about Indian women. He says they criticize us for the parda. So this is the first criticism, for the parda. Secondly, polygamy, that Muslim men and Hindu men very often marry many times, of course, which was a rampant, tradition at that point of time. Male-initiated divorce, is probably talking about the talaq. Is the inequality in judicial testimony. The testimony of men was treated in with far greater importance than that of the woman. Marginalization of widows, widow burnings, renouncing of the widows to Kashi, for example, was one of the common tropes. And arranged marriage, that all Indian marriages were arranged and there was no love marriage in that sense of the term. So he takes them all point by point and tries to sort of answer as to how Indian women are much better off. Let us see what are the projections that he makes, what are the arguments that he makes. He suggests that he agrees that Indian and Asiatic women live more secluded lives, but he says it's a more positive feature which is suited to the Indian temperament. Because of parda, he says that the Indian women are more comfortable, safe, and autonomous. That's a very interesting argument. Are safer, more comfortable, and autonomous. He says they do not have to, because of the parda, mix with the vulgar mob, the low and the rude in the streets. So there's an added dimension of safety. And he says that, because of this parda, they can remain at home and they run their homes with far greater authority than the British women. The British women, of course, have no servants, so they have to, work harder in their homes. And Abu Talib says that Indian women, because of the parda, they can have servants and they can work more comfortably with their children and devote more time to their children at home. Right. So he's offering privacy as a kind of a counter to this discourse of, reducing the woman in the parda. Quite obviously, as I keep on saying, Abu Talib's patriarchal bias is very, very powerful here. Right. But you see the kind of defense, the ferocious defense that he provides, refusing to allow such, liberal ideas within the Indian space of the parda. Now, polygamy is a more difficult, as it were, kind of allegation to defend, but that's a very interesting defense that Abu Talib possesses. He says that women have difficult times during pregnancy, lactation, and menstruation, and that at these points of time the men make their demands on women. So if there are more than one wife, the wife can peacefully pass off these periods without acceding to the sexual demands of men. So he's suggesting that to satisfy the husband's wants, more than one wife is quite necessary. And he says that the laws about inheritance is very clear, and the first wife, the first wife is actually enjoys the status of the legal wife in the West, and that all subsequent wives get a lesser share of property. It's very interesting. Even I guess Abu Talib knows that these are no defenses at all, but he's very unwilling to allow any kind of encroachment into the Indian domestic sphere through transculturation. He then talks about this concept of the talaq, and he suggests that while, and this is a debate which I think has more modern relevances really, and he makes this argument that while Indian men do have the sort of independence to give talaq, triple talaq very quickly, very few actually do it. And therefore, society, as it were, frowns upon men who marry and trivially give their women talaq. So it's social protection which is offered to women rather than legal protection. Abu Talib is, of course, not talking about the Brahminical system of the Kulin Brahmins marrying here and there, but then I guess there is no sustained defense of any specific Hindu custom, as it were, in Abu Talib's travels. The fourth sort of allegation is that Islamic courts privilege male witnesses. Now, Abu Talib is a very, very stringent patriarch here. He says, men are much more, truthful and reliable witnesses than women, and therefore they gave more reliable testimony based on their wider knowledge and experience of the world and on their less fickle natures. So Abu Talib is here, sort of falling into that Oriental trope of, being the patriarch who considers the woman as somebody who's unreliable, somebody who's fickle in their affections. Now, then he comes to this question of the Indian widow and their sort of marginalization in life. But he suggests that widows, this is for the betterment of the widows, because widows are, liable to be targeted by unscrupulous elements and fall into prostitution. So, marginalizing them into ghettos is probably one way of protecting them. Now, these are all very retrograde kind of arguments, but you can see, what is happening, that in the public sphere, in technology, in terms of law and administration, Abu Talib is willing to allow transculturation and willing to be transformed by British mores and ways. But within the domestic religious space, Abu Talib is fiercely protecting himself, and his Indianness, as it were, his Asiatic nature, against any kind of encroachment by the Western ideas. Now, you will, of course, find that there is a tension between Hindu and Muslim ways of sort of approaching this question. Although, of course, Hindu society was equally orthodox, I would say that the Enlightenment entered Hindu society far faster, probably as a result of Raja Ram Mohan and the Bengal Renaissance. And we find that time and again, you see, there are revisions in the condition of women within Hindu society, whereas, there is a larger orthodoxy within the 19th and the early 20th century that remains grafted within Muslim society. But you can see and you can sense how Abu Talib's travelogue is, as it were, sort of one of the texts which is becoming, in many ways, the argument of Muslim patriarchy, as it were, and the refusal to allow, any great change being made by Western ideas. The last thing that he suggests is that, and that is where, Abu Talib probably has some logic. In the earlier ones, he's largely repeating patriarchal assumptions. And therefore, the more liberal Abu Talib of the travels is actually looking at the more conservative and pre-modern individual of the vindication. So it's only in the last, as it were, justification that Indian marriages are always arranged, whereas there is the scope for love marriages in the Western tradition. He suggests that in the aristocratic marriages of the West, most marriages are arranged in terms of property and convenience. So although they appear to be love marriages, they are in reality, more subtly managed marriages. So, the West and the East are not so different in this context. Now, this is what Abu Talib's vindication is all about. Quite obviously, and this is something that I keep on making, Abu Talib's view seems to be divided into two personalities. The public Abu Talib, who interacts freely with Western women and Western society and aristocracy, is the more progressive, open Abu Talib, who can allow for transformations in Indian society in terms of technology, administration, science, military powers, and so on. This is a perceptive Abu Talib, who recognizes how European society is dominant because of its technology, how European imperialism is going to be present in India, and what are the relationships between technology, economic advancement, liberty, and political, as it were, much more political democracy. Now, he sees, for example, Turkey and Baghdad as sites of great tyranny, and he sees them as pre-modern and underdeveloped as a result. So this is the open and progressive Abu Talib, who somehow bringing within himself many of the precepts of the Enlightenment. Now then there is another Abu Talib, who is steadfastly pre-modern, patriarchal, and extremely, we'll not call him fundamentalist, but extremely sort of protectionist about his own religion. And this Abu Talib refuses any kind of transformation or any kind of allegation against his religion. He is fiercely, protective about his faith. And then is a more conservative Abu Talib, who is out and out, blatantly anti-enlightenment, fundamentalist, patriarchal, when it comes to the defense of the treatment of women in the Asiatic. Not only is he doing that, he's not only defending the sort of the tyranny against women, the tyranny of patriarchy against women, he's suggesting insidiously that actually instead of tyranny, these women are much more liberal. So he's sort of trying to use the European rhetoric. You remember the vindication is being used by Mary Wollstonecraft to argue about the rights of women. He's talking about the vindication of the liberty of Asiatic women. And he's using that register, the trope, the kind of narrative strategy to claim insidiously that Western, Eastern women are much more, moral and much more, sort of, as it were, liberated rather, than the Western women, who are all fallen and therefore leading to prostitution and extramarital affairs. So, in a way, instead of to answer certain Orientalist stereotypings, Abu Talib is creating alternative stereotypings, looking at all Eastern women as liberated, all Western women as fallen. So he's kind of trying to pay back the idea of the Orientalist discourse that all Oriental men are sensual, and that the Oriental is a feminine which must be probed, the dark space behind the harem, the parda, and the zanana. Instead, he suggests that it is the open, liberated space of the Western woman, which is a trope of great, licentiousness and promiscuity. So Abu Talib is, as it were, answering one kind of stereotyping with another kind of stereotyping. Now, this is not to support any of these stereotypings, but to give you an idea of how within the contact zones, autoethnographies are created and transculturation happens. Abu Talib is happy to allow the transculturation of his Muslim brethren when it comes to technology, administration, legality, although he does not very much like the Western legality, but he still realizes that there's no way but to change, because the British are a superior power. But when it comes to the question of religion and women, he is fundamentally shutting the gate against transculturation, and is autoethnographically trying to prove that Eastern society, Oriental society, is far more liberal when it comes to Western, to their women. Now, in doing so, he's using the derivative discourse of the vindication that Mary Wollstonecraft had already written. So he's using the Western discourse and turning the logic inside out. Now, many of you will immediately recognize, when I use the term derivative discourse, the shadows of Partho Chatterjee behind it and the ideas of nationalism. This is what the Indian nationalists were also doing, using the nationalist discourse of the West and thereby deriving a nationalist discourse of their own and turning it inside out. But even in Indian nationalism, that is the point that I'm trying to lead to. And, somebody, of course, talked about how Abu Talib had not aged well. You see, in this sphere, Indian nationalist discourse created a very clear cleavage, a kind of a distinction between the exterior world, the public world, and the antapur, and the inner world, which the Indian modernity was trying to similarly sort of preserve. So you remember the debate between the Anglicists, the moderns and the ancients in terms of the Indian kind of a dialogue. There was a ferocious fight over the issue of widow remarriage, over the issue of women's education, and of course, Raja Ram Mohan Roy's, fundamental, movement against sati. And you will find that, even within the Tagore family and the Bengal Renaissance, there were very clear, divisions between the Antapur and the Bahir, in that sense, the home and the world, when it came to the condition of women. So people like Radhakrishna Dev, for example, were fundamentally against any kind of, change that women could undergo. And the fact remains that while we adapted, especially in the masculine sphere and in the masculine public sphere, Western modernity with far greater, with far greater speed, in terms of the private sphere, we adapted our sort of changes with far with at a far lesser pace, as it were. So, the kind of reservations that Abu Talib had about religion and women were replicated in many ways in our nationalist discourses also. Although I would agree, if you countered me by saying that Abu Talib is extremely patriarchal, extremely fundamentalist when it comes to his condition of women. But such has been the history of Indian modernity when it sort of really talked about its women. The pace of reform has been far slower than in our embrace of modernity, and that is where I see, even in the way in which we sort of even in the postmodern age, as I speak, the ways in which the treatment of women has still lagged behind in many ways from our Western counterparts. So these were comments that I intended to make about Abu Talib's treatment of technology and his vindication about women. But let me now fold up my discussion. I've had a long session almost every day, and I've sort of discussed more or less the text threadbare. Abu Talib is one of the probably the first major travelers who not only traveled during the counterflow to colonialism in the early phase, but he was also one of the most important recorders of this encounter. So, if Deen Muhammad was the first to record this in English, Abu Talib's travelogue is far, you can say, far rigorous, far more significant, because he covers the major points of encounter between the West and the East. Not only that, he brings in a tradition of the Persian travelogue to interact with the more empirical travelogue of the West. And he engages in this transculturation of form, where the Ode and the Masnavi poem can interact, where the Safarnama and the empirical travelogue can interact. So while there were Muslim travelers before Abu Talib, the degree of rigor and the widest possible coverage of society that Abu Talib gives, and remember that he's talking not only about England, he's talking about France, Italy, Turkey, Constantinople, Baghdad. So he's giving a kind of a cosmopolitan panorama of cultures of the West and the East. In this, Abu Talib remains unique. Point number one. Point number two, Abu Talib remains unique in identifying specific spots, spaces, traditions, which make the English colonial apparatus tick. So, unlike other travelers who were marked by a sense of wonder and excitement, Abu Talib's travelogue was far critical because it identifies the ways in which technology, economic advancement kind of articulated or kind of fused with the improvement of the condition of the poor people and aided the imperial apparatus. And therefore, you see, at the heart of Abu Talib's travelogue, the middle of Abu Talib's travelogue, lies his description of the East India Company. See, he realized it was the company which was making Britain great, not its other, or not the other way around. Tagore would talk about the parliament. Tagore would talk about, music, other cultural institutions. So would other travelers. But Abu Talib goes to the heart of the matter. He identifies the naval dockyard, the cannonballs, the technology, the hothouses, the manufacturing, the spinning machine as aspects which integrated military advancement, colonial expansion, economic expansion, the East India Company, and British greatness. So in this, Abu Taleb remains unique. Thirdly, this is very important, Abu Taleb also offers very critical responses. He identifies the ways which of the vices of the British, identifies them in three directions: irreligiosity, the kind of pride, insolence, disrespect of other cultures that the British have because of their colonial prowess. He satirizes them as John Bull, suggests that the Irish and the French are much more humane than the British, who are far more, rapacious, greedy. And he associates this greed and luxury together. So Abu Taleb's characterization of the British shows the first resistances within post-colonial society to British senses of superiority, British dismissals of Indian systems, British allegations of Indian depravities and pre-modernities, and the distinction between England as modern versus the Asiatic as pre-modern. So he's trying to write back to this discourse, but the crucial difference remains that Abu Taleb, because of his status as the Persian prince, because he mixes around, hobnobs with the royalty, can offer to criticize, make this critique, and write back in terms of equality. Unlike later colonial travelers who always have this sense of being in the waiting room of history, trying to break into modernity. So there's no kind of great anxiety within Abu Taleb. There's no sense of inferiority. He's writing with a great stance of equality. So this is the third point that I want you to note. The fourth point, of course, I have rambled on today. There are clear divisions where Abu Taleb wants transculturation. There are clear traditions where Abu Taleb, in the public sphere, in science, technology, administration, military, Abu Taleb wants the contact zone to benefit and percolate down to his Muslim counterparts, although he's not very hopeful. And that is the reason that he's written this travelogue in Persian for his Persian readership to understand what Western modernity is and therefore imitate it. And paradoxically, the same liberal Abu Taleb closes the door of transculturation and autoethnographically tries to write the vindication of the liberty of Asiatic women. So it's there are clear demarcated zones of religion and the domestic world where no transculturation is allowed. Finally, I would like to take a look at this paradox of this man who traveled to England because he was broke. He was traveling to England with the hope that the long, arduous journey would actually kill him off. And he arrives in London and becomes the toast of the town, known as the Persian prince, and therefore granted access to almost all nooks and corners of British society. When he comes back, this Persian prince of London, who's known as the Persian prince, the Oriental stereotype of the nobility in London, when he comes back to India and is known as Abu Taleb Londoni. So the Persian prince now becomes the Abu Taleb Londoni, a stereotype of the transculturated Indian. So it's fascinating in the way in which the identities of Abu Taleb swing between his, as it were, clientele. In England, the Persian prince, Oriental stereotype. In India, Abu Taleb Londoni, the transculturated stereotype. The Persian travels written for his Muslim counterparts, and therefore asking them to embrace science. Translated by the British Charles Stewart, circulated among the English audience as a proof that, the Muslims of India are awed by British technology and are therefore, British governance and British imperialism is welcomed by them. Abu Talib's travels, therefore, in their different languages, written in 1803 in Persian, translated and published in 1810 in English, thereby becomes involved in this colonial politics of the early 19th century, where the company is now under the crown and is gradually moving into the great behemoth that it will be under Queen Victoria, the grand agent of Imperial Britain. Abu Talib's travelogue in this early part of colonialism remains a testament to how travel writing is implicated within the politics of the empire. So it is with these comments then, these final comments then, that I would like to bring this discussion on Abu Talib to a close. We've traveled a long way with Abu Talib. We started off from Kolkata and then moved on to Cork, Dublin, London, Paris. We've been to Constantinople, we've been to Baghdad, we've been to Najaf, we've been to Karbala, to Bombay, and then back to Kolkata. In the process, the Persian prince has become Abu Talib Londoni. Thank you for having sort of endured this journey with me. And I'll take the one question that I think has come through from Tasnova. He suggests that, she suggests that, the dilemma about the home and the world is prevalent in the discussion of women, in his discussion of women, suggesting that women are powerful in their domestic sphere. But he doesn't make any comments about Tasnova. You probably did not complete this question. It remains, she has, about the role of women. Sorry, let me just read it a little more carefully. About the role of women outside the home of the Zanana. Isn't his conservative patriarchal self that celebrates, in a way, the patriarchal norms, stereotypes against women by converting the so-called well, she's typing, yes, but I get the drift of the question, really. It is absolutely, I agree with it. The Abu Talib of the public sphere is not the Abu Talib of the domestic sphere. It's deeply implicated in the patriarchy. Negative images that into positive one, and critiques the liberty of women in the Western world. Yes, he critiques the liberty of women in the Western world. The answer to this probably comes, as you will find in Tagore's work, which you study next. Tagore sees the liberty of women, their entry into the public world with their companion, and in the way in which the liberty of the women produces much more fundamentally happier families, as it were. And therefore, you see, Abu Talib's critique about the women, is coming from his very stringent patriarchal position. And therefore, this justification of the vindication, I would say, takes a lot of gloss away from the travelogue. I guess Abu Talib knew this, so he did not put this within the travelogue as such, right? And he was trying to, put a kind of patriarchal spin on this image of women that he was positing. So, isn't it his conservative patriarchal self that celebrates, in a way, the patriarchal norms? Yes, he does. He celebrates it, and he kind of sees this. He's very triumphant about it. He says that West is an immoral society, the East is a more moral society because of the presence of two things. One, their religious devotion, and two, the way in which they can protect their women from modernity. So in this sense, Abu Taleb does not see modernity as beneficial to society, but as something which is essentially inimical. Madhurima has a question. He says, it's quite interesting that Abu Taleb mingled with the English higher society, but he talked about scientific innovations which were beneficial for common people, not the research institutes. Yes. Now, you see, I have not gone into the names of the people that he meets and the details of the higher society sort of people that he meets. But let me put it this way, that Abu Taleb not only met the king, the prince, and the queen, but he met almost every important official. You can talk about Cornwallis, you can talk about the Exchequer General, he meets the commander of the British Army, he meets the directors of the East India Company. So the aristocrats he meets, and he meets all the contemporary women also, of course, the aristocratic women, but they do not interest me in the sense, because just putting these names would make really no difference to us now. But you are right in the sense that Abu Taleb is very, very perceptive when it comes to science and technology. We witnesses that, you see, while the aristocracy would be leading the war probably, and the generals would be drawn from the aristocracy, what was the mechanism of the empire? The mechanism of the empire was in the fact that, a large amount of resources were being drawn away from India, and a large number of common people were participating in the process of empire. Now, the building of empire is not really about conquest, which is an integral part, but equally, empire is also about sustaining this and dividing the spoils of empire within the common people. So the growth of London, and you see, he makes this point that when he's writing about London, Abu Taleb really rarely ventures outside it. Now, there are very few passages in the text where Abu Taleb is traveling to the countryside. Even if he's going there, he's going to some, aristocratic household. But it is within London that he sees this rapid transformation of the Indian people. And of the British people. And it is when he goes to Constantinople or when he goes to Baghdad, he sees the squalor, the filth, the poverty of the common people. And he contrasts this with his account of the British people and sees that colonialism and imperialism are reasons that have produced this transformation, generated employment, provided luxury, made their lives easier. So you are right, Madhurima, that Abu Taleb is a very shrewd traveler. He does not merely wonder at the transformations of the machinery. He also locates what are the reasons for English superiority. Secondly, what has this superiority done to the common people, and how has it improved the profile of the British ordinary life? So in that sense, Abu Taleb provides us with critical insights. You see, record of empirical details do not fascinate travel writing readers. What conclusions does the traveler draw? And the third thing that he does is he realizes that to transfer this to his Indian counterparts and to get this imitation going, his travelogue might be an important text. So in many ways, you see, the travelogue is a window that opens for the reader into a different world, and therefore the winds of change very often are also generated through a deliberate rhetoric, which is, which sort of builds continuously up. Now you see, the English also made laws which transformed our societies: abolition of the sati, introduction of scientific education. But it was largely, you see, the demand of the Indians which provoked this. And the demand of the Indians was largely generated through their familiarization with Western society through the travelogues. So the role of the travelogue in transforming society, in opening up a window to another culture, is something that is very, very important. Now, Zulfikar had this question. Abu Talib's account highlights the important issues of cultural identity. To what extent does the narrator identify with the British? You see, this is a very fundamental question that Zulfikar is asking us. Now, Abu Talib is very conscious about his Muslim identity, about his Asiatic identity, right? Now, he sees that the Asiatic identity needs a degree of evolution. And what is this evolution? He says that, Asiatics had once the ability of science, but it got lost. So it needs to recover its scientific, modern identity. But when it comes to, and therefore he's willing to be transcultured in that way, right? He's willing to imitate the Britisher and bring back the diagrams and put them into use in his own country. But when it comes to transforming his identity vis-a-vis religion and domesticity, Abu Talib is fiercely protective of his identity. And therefore he does not, in the text, is very vehement about the ways in which his salient identity as a Muslim in terms of religion and in terms, or as an Asiatic in terms of religion and in terms of domestic space, needs to be preserved. So it is in this way that Abu Talib is probably allowing only a partial, change in identity, right? So I hope that answers your question, right? So what I've tried to do is to suggest to you the ways in which, if we are using, right, Pratt as a theoretical tool in our first lectures, and I talked at length about her book. But what happens and how does this actually be put into action? How do contact zones operate? What is the moment at which transculturation takes place? What is the degree of transculturation that takes place? What is the attitude of the travelogue towards transculturation? And finally, how does one autoethnographically write identity? So I started off this discussion with Abu Talib. Obviously, Dipankar is going to continue this with Rabindranath's travelogue. And should you read any other travelogues, I want you to test this hypothesis and see how cultural identity, how ways of appropriation of modernity take place in the travelogues of the 19th and the 20th centuries. Right. It is with that then, therefore, I bring this discussion of Abu Talib to a close. Thank you for offering me the privilege of, interacting with you and talking about Abu Talib. We'll take a break of 2 days, once again over the weekend, allow you to sort of gather up your thoughts. And then it's going to be a totally different ball game altogether, as we are going to straight away shift from the early 19th to the 20th century, as it were, to the 21st century, as it were. And we'll be initiating a discussion on Vishwanath Ghosh's travelogue, Chai Chai. So see you Monday, 10:30, with, the drink that is becoming the toast of the nation, chai. I will, of course, talk about Vishwanath's, railway travels and the ways in which he talks about the different Indias that exist within its small towns. So look forward to your participation in those lectures as well. Thank you very much and have a very good day.